Today, we're going to continue into the Bedford murders that's baffled most experienced investigators, even been a Netflix special on it. And it has caught the attention of even presidents of countries. So who really did the killing? This and more on this episode of Charlie Crimebuster. Yep, it's what some people are calling the fastest minutes in podcasting.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individuals interviewed and participating in this show, and do not represent those of Charlie Crimebuster or Peacemaker Network. All individuals described or mentioned in the podcast should be considered innocent until found guilty in a court of law. This podcast contains subject matter such as violence and graphic descriptions, which may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
Well, hello and welcome to this episode of Charlie Crimebuster. Boy, we do have a whodunit on the line today. I got to tell you, this has been a most impressive cold case to study. I have been actually on one side one day and on the other side the other day. Well, we're going to be getting into that on today's episode. Well, first, let me say welcome to all of the new listeners at Charlie Crimebuster. We appreciate the fact that you're taking time to listen to the podcasts. And we always want to encourage you to reach out with a shout out. You can reach me, charliecrimebuster at gmail.com, charliecrimebuster at gmail.com. And as we get some of the housekeeping out of the way before we get right to the source of the subject, let me also invite you to be a part of our supporters. You can support the program and the first responders, the military, and the cops by going to peacemakernetwork.com, peacemakernetwork.com. There you can become a badge, BADGE supporter for as little as $3 a month. Again, we invite you to reach out with a shout-out. You can reach us at charliecrimebuster at gmail.com. If you'd like to support the program, go over to peacemakernetwork.com. Now, if you haven't been following along, we're in part 3 of this incredible code case that happened back in 1985 there in Bedford, Virginia. That's when Derek and Nancy Haysom body was discovered. You see, they had been slashed and stabbed to death in their home in the Boonesboro neighborhood of Lynchburg, Virginia. So if you haven't been following that, let me encourage you to go to charliecrimebuster.com. charliecrimebuster.com, you can get caught up on all of the series. Better yet, just go ahead on your special platform, your podcast platform, and go ahead and subscribe to the program. That way, you're going to get the Charlie episodes every single week. While you're there, leave us a good response, if you would, please. We would appreciate that. It helps more people to hear about Charlie Crimebuster and the code cases and the other cases that we cover. So now back to that day, April the 3rd, 1985. That's when these bodies of Derek and Nancy Haysom was discovered. The murders happened, they believe, back in March, around the last day of March. Now, they were really terribly, brutally murdered. They had been slashed, stabbed to death. They actually, there in this particular neighborhood, that kind of crime just was unheard of. In fact, they were almost decapitated. I mean, their heads were almost just cut right off. It was a terrible murder. They had been stabbed numerous times. In fact, most of the people in law enforcement there at the scene, they easily called it a, quote, crime of passion. That's usually because there's overkill. Now, investigators at even the state police there in Virginia, they thought at first, well, it could be the results of a cult killing. Yep, a satanic killing. Kind of like a Charles Manson kind of thing. Didn't happen too long after the Charles Manson murders. Now, they looked into that and they investigated that possibility, but they run into a dead end there. Then they all realized that Derek Haysom was a successful businessman. He had to run large companies overseas, but no doubt he had enemies who might want to do something to him. Even that was investigated. And then there was the groundskeeper, always the groundskeeper, seems like in these stories, isn't it? You see, he had recently been fired, and by the way, he had a criminal record. He, too, was investigated. And then there was the spurned lover, a girlfriend of one of their sons, who thought that maybe his parents, Derek and Nancy, had not approved of their son dating her. Even she was investigated. But some months later into the investigation, investigators turned to the only birth child of Derek and Nancy. You see, there were other siblings who were brought into this marriage, but in this marriage, the one birth child was Elizabeth Haysom. She was about 18 years of age at this time. You see, during the timeline of the murder, Haysom, she had rented a car, and her boyfriend, Jen Soring, drove to Washington, D.C., they said, to visit the town, have a weekend away from the campus just to themselves, look around Washington, D.C., but it actually turned into a trip to establish an alibi, according to others. But you see, Haysom and Soring were not initially suspects in Haysom's murders. You see, Haysom had even organized all the details of her parents' funeral. She was seen as the grieving young daughter of these slayed parents. Well, within a few months, authorities had checked the records for the rental car that Elizabeth and Jen's had used and found out that the total mileage during the rental, it far exceeded a single round trip to Washington, D.C. that they claimed that they had taken. But it did almost match up identically to going to Washington, driving back to Elizabeth's parents' home, then back to Washington, and then back to Charlottesville to turn in the vehicle. Those miles just about matched. So the Virginia police, they turned their focus to the couple, and then the couple fled the country. You see, 6 months after the murder, and they had been into a number of countries, Soring and Haysom, they did go into another bunch of other countries, and they took off to England, and then they were arrested on April the 30th, 1986, a little more after 1 year from the killings. Now, those arrests at that time wasn't for the killing, wasn't for the murder. The authorities did not know when they arrested Jens and Elizabeth, they did not know that they were actually on the run, you might say, from the authorities in Bedford, Virginia. It was during that time that they were arrested on financial charges. But then they uncovered some letters, some very, very strange letters. Letters that indicated that something might be afoul back in Virginia, that somebody might have wanted their parents eliminated, that there may have been a murder that took place. So authorities there in England reached out to authorities in Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia, and there, a plane flight across the pond back to England from Virginia, and they were questioning Jen Soring and Elizabeth Haysom. And during this time, the boyfriend, Jen Soring, confessed to law enforcement that he had done the murders alone, while Elizabeth stayed in Washington, D.C. to fix his alibi. Haysom then, 23 years of age at this time, pleaded guilty to 2 counts of accessory to murder before the fact, and was sentenced to 90 years in prison, one 45-year sentence for each murder to be served consecutively. Now, under the questioning by the British, American, and West German and Virginia authorities, you got to get that out right. I almost said West Virginia. Let me try that again. Questioning by British, American, West German, and Virginia authorities, Soring confessed to the double murder. Several times he did, to several authorities, even including the medical persons that were examining him. Now, Haysom, meanwhile, she waived extradition. She came back to the trial, but Soren, he fought extradition, fought it on the basis that capital punishment, and especially the exposure to the so-called death row phenomenon, by that we're talking about the emotional distress felt by prisoners on death row. My, they get stressed because they killed other people, can you imagine? But he says, and his attorney says, that that would constitute inhuman and degrading treatment as forbidden. Now, these are some big words, so hang on to your hat. Forbidden by the Article 3 of the European Convention of Human Rights. And so, my friend, on July the 7th, 1989, the European Court of Human Rights agreed with the assessment and ruled in Soren versus the United Kingdom that extradition to countries where the accused would face death row phenomenon is unlawful. So now, Bedford County, back in the Commonwealth of Virginia, they have to make a decision. If they really want to extradite him, if they really want to get him back, if they really want to try him for the murder of Elizabeth's parents, then are they willing to take the death penalty off the board? So the authorities did. They agreed not to pursue the death penalty. And Soren, well, he was extradited back to the United States on the 12th of January, 1990, some 5 years after the murder. But, my friend, now hold on. It was while on trial in Virginia that the bombshell was dropped. Soren now recanted his confession, stated under oath that he did not kill her parents, but that he was taking the fall for Elizabeth, because he thought that because he was son of a diplomat, he thought he had diplomatic immunity from the charges. Now, if that was his true intentions or not, he was mistaken, because his dad did not serve at a United States embassy, but at a consulate, and therefore he did not have such immunity. Any way that goes, the jury simply did not buy his story, and Soren was found guilty, was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. Story over, right? Not quite. There was some questionable DNA evidence becomes available later, and that, my friend, divided investigators over the possibility that Jen's conviction was a wrongful conviction. It was all going on in that moment that something happened in this case. We're going to tell you all about that in just a moment. But right now, it's time for a Crazy Crook story. We always try to tell a Crazy Crook story to kind of lighten the load of some of the dark stuff that we cover. And this Crazy Crook story comes from right down here in Florida. You always heard Florida man being Googled, how crazy things can happen. I was telling a good acquaintance just yesterday, I was saying that I never get out of Crazy Crook stories living in Florida. All you got to do is Google Florida man. But this is not a Florida man, it's a Florida woman. It was a porch pirate, and she was caught on the camera being a Grinch, stealing Amazon Christmas packages in broad daylight. And her plan was to re-gift them. Well, that's what Florida police said. Kinsley Mott, 32 years of age, was seen on a victim's home surveillance camera walking up to the porch and taking numerous Amazon boxes. And then she drove off in a red, no, not sleigh, don't say that, not sleigh. She didn't drive off in a red sleigh, she drove off in a red truck. This is all according to Polk County Sheriff's Office. You see, Mott had her prize in her eyes, so she followed the Amazon delivery truck to a subdivision down in Winter Haven, Florida. And there she stole the packages from front porches in the neighborhoods. That was between noon and 12:30 p.m. That's what police say. Now, after reviewing the victim's surveillance videos, investigators found Mott at her place of employment, a Hungry Howl's restaurant. Authorities said when they asked Mott about the evidence, she said deputies that, well, she was just planning on re-gifting the stolen items at Christmas. Now, according to Sheriff Judd, and you haven't met Grady Judd, you should. But when deputies asked her to return the packages so they could return them to her owners, well, she refused. Well, then, according to Judd, when shown the doorbell footage from stealing the packages, she responded, and here's where we get our crazy crook. She said, well, what if it was someone else who just had my face? Yeah, sure. So now, Judd says she's got a red nose because she's been crying at some point in time. So here comes some more Christmas entry, if you please. The red nose, not the red-nosed reindeer, but the red-nosed porch pirate. And Judd, he told this at a press conference on Wednesday. He said, this is not Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer. He said, this is Kinsley the red-nosed criminal, locked up porch pirate. Now, the sheriff also said that during the holidays, porch pirates are most prevalent and encourage residents to invest into a security system. He said it's that time of the year that the porch pirates are out. If all possible, have your package delivered when someone's home, or maybe to a friend or neighbor's home, or even to your place of business. If not, he goes on to say, invest in a security system that alerts you immediately someone's on your porch. And then he went on to say that this red-nosed thief is probably going to spend Christmas behind bars this year. And by the way, she had a lengthy criminal history dating back to 2016. She was arrested, put into the popo there in Polk County for theft, felony petty theft, and 2 counts of burglary of a dwelling. So this, my friend, this porch thief, who had a red nose and thought that she could convince police that maybe someone else had her face. This, indeed, is Charlie Crimebuster's Crazy Crook of the Week. And just before we get into our main focus, let me urge you to be alert of Christmas scams, since this is one of our episodes to be released just almost a week before Christmas. There's astonishing rise of attacks through social engineering, and particularly the package scam is, well, it's out there. Very, very, very popular. You see, they lure you in with a promise of a package waiting to be delivered. But you first must pay the fees first. Beware of that, because, my friend, you will just be throwing away your money into the hands of thieves. It's a very popular scam today, so be on the alert for it. Don't give in to these thefts, scam artists that are out there. Well, now back to our main focus. Jen Soren is now claiming that his confession was all a noble act on his part to take the fall for the woman that he loved. According to many who were actually familiar with his trial, there were actually two pieces of evidence that swayed the jury. One was a sock print that was introduced by showing an overlay of the print of Soren's feet over that print. And another was the fact that he had type O blood that was left at the scene. Jen's had type O blood. Now, not anyone else in the household had that type of blood. Now, even though we know today that 45% of people have type O blood, well, the prosecutor made this a really big deal, referred to it about 26 times, even during his closing statement. Now, there are experts and authorities that are commenting on these two topics of evidence. You see, there are many that believe that the sock print analysis was nothing but quote-unquote junk science. They even say that the expert who testified was not an expert in footprints. And it is very rare that a sock print is ever placed into evidence in a murder trial. So many think that this was not credible evidence to convict Jens of this murder. Next, as I mentioned before, there are 45% of the people who have type O blood. So based on the fact that this was evidence used against Jens, well, some think it's pretty weak. Now remember, though, at this time, DNA was not being used in trials. So unlike the sock print that was not used in many trials, the type of one's blood was quite normal to mention into murder trials. So, yep, he had type O blood. Type O blood was left at the crime scene. The jury had an opportunity to consider that in their deliberating. Just one big problem came about years after the verdict. You see the type O blood? Well, it was later checked for DNA, and guess what? The DNA with type O blood, well, that DNA was not Jen Soring. It was not Jen Soring DNA. So immediately, overnight almost it seemed, Jen Soring's case of an alleged wrongful conviction that he had shouted out for years there behind bars, well now, it had new credibility, and it attracted the attention of lots of other people, other investigators, other experts, even celebrities, and even leaders of nations. For instance, John Grisham, one of my favorite writers, very popular fiction writer, he actually came to believe in Jen's defense. There was a local nearby sheriff who used DNA to catch all kinds of suspects of cold cases in a neighboring neighborhood in a different jurisdiction. He also came to his rescue. Known champions of the Innocence Project came to his rescue. Well, I said rescue, but I guess it'd be more fitting to say attempted rescue, because my friend, the Bedford Police Department, the Bedford prosecutors, they're not caving. They still, to this day, believe that they got their man, that they got the right person for these murders. And Elizabeth Haysom, who pleaded guilty. She pled guilty. She said, yeah, I was part of it. I was an accomplice after the fact. I deserved to be in jail, in prison. Well, she still sticks to her story that Jens did the murders himself. So the bottom line here, my friend, there are two camps. There are those who believe the daughter, Elizabeth, and those who believe Jen Soring. And to make matters more difficult, both of them are liars. I mean, that's been proven throughout the case. Both of them are liars. You can't say you can't believe this one because that one lies, because both of them lies. And my friend, I got to tell you, there are good people in both camps. Experienced law enforcement, expert witnesses, and scientists, successful people in their own sphere of influence, all of these good people are divided about who is really telling the truth. That only leaves us really with the evidence that we can lean one way or the other to determine who really killed Derek and Nancy Haysom. So now, we're going to look at Jen Soring's plea of innocence. His plea of innocence for doing the actual murders, and let you decide for yourself who is telling the truth. Now, next week, you're going to hear my own take on who did the murders. And I got to tell you, boy, this has not been an easy one for me. It's been challenging. I don't feel too bad about that. I mean, lots of good people see this differently. Lots of experts see it differently. So I found myself throughout this investigation by research, I found myself leaning one way one day and leaning the other way the next day, back and forth, back and forth. That is until I finally found my footing on who really did the killing. And I'm going to tell you about that next week. Now, before I get into this, I mentioned on our past episode that Netflix had completed a documentary on the case. What was interesting about that particular documentary was that at the end of it, they came to the conclusion, now get this, that both of them did the killing. And that, for many, my friend, was an easy way out of deciding who did it. But I do not see that the case. I think evidence puts at least one of them back at the motel in Washington, setting up the alibi for the other. We have the movie tickets, the room service that was signed for, and the time that it was signed for. And we have those who testified from Washington, D.C. in the trial. Well, my friend, that confirms to me the murders were not done by both of them. Both of them could not have been there and at the Washington, D.C. motel at the same time, the killings. But only one of them was actually there doing the killing. But which one was it? So here we go. We're going to talk about some of the reasons Jen Soring thinks that he's innocent, says that he's innocent, of killing these two people, Derek and Nancy Haysom. Jens and his supporters say that, first of all, the investigators ignored the FBI profile. According to them, the FBI profile, well, it stated the murders was a crime of passion most likely committed by a female. Jen says investigators ignored this profile, rushed to judgment against him. Then he says that, investigators should have known that his confession was false because he got things wrong at the crime scene. Mainly, he said Nancy was wearing blue jeans when actually she was wearing a house coat. He says in his confession that he also got the position of Derek's body wrong as he confessed to the killings. It wasn't where he said it was exactly. Then he refers to Elizabeth's story where she said that when he got back, she met him, saw him, that in the rental car he was covered with blood and had a bed sheet. She escorted him to the motel, later went out and checked that the blood on the carpet, she tried to clean it with Coca-Cola. But, my friend, later on, when investigators did check that car for blood, they used, the spray, and it did not reveal any blood whatsoever. So that meant that Elizabeth had to be lying about that. If she's lying about that, she's lying about everything else, and she was the murderer. He says because there's no blood in the car, he could not have driven there and back with blood on him. However, the most impressive evidence that Jens uses and his supporters is the fact that his DNA, I should say, was not found in the type O blood found at the crime scene. And he goes on to say that proves another male person was there the night of the murders. And in his story, he says Elizabeth told him she had to go do a drug run back to their home area for her drug pusher, that he could not go because he didn't look like the drug type of person. And that while she was there doing this drug run, her and an unknown male, he says, went to her home and killed her parents. That he was the one back there developing an alibi for her, because she said he needed to do that because if her parents found out she was still doing drugs, she'd be in big trouble. So she would have an alibi for them that she wasn't down there doing drugs. She was up there in Washington with Jens Soring. He also adds there were other footprints that were not his, and there was a hair left in the bathroom sink that was not tested. Add to this that while the family was cleaning up the blood-stained crime scene, some people say that Elizabeth was observed by others putting her foot down to see if her foot matched the footprints on the blood. He also says investigators in England did not treat him fairly. He had requested an attorney. They did not provide him with one. His rights were not respected, and the confession was coerced out of him. Now, his continued pursuit of this innocence by these facts and others, and by others who also were fighting for his freedom, it did finally get him his freedom. Not the way he wanted it. He wanted to be pardoned. But it did get him paroled. So both he and Elizabeth, I guess Virginia took the easy way out. They had already been in prison for over 30 years, so he and Elizabeth both were paroled in 2019. It seems that such pressure was put on authorities in the state of Virginia. Well, they just took the easy way out, paroled both of them at the same time, under the condition now that Jens would go to Germany, would not be allowed back in the States because he was a German citizen, and Elizabeth would go to Canada, where she was born and had a passport, to live out the rest of her life there. Both of them are now free, but on parole. And I know there are those of you to say, well, boy, I'm really pressured on this because maybe one of them should not have been in prison that long. Maybe Jen should not be in prison. He's an innocent man, wrongfully convicted. But may I remind you, my friend, that regardless of who did the killing, both of them conspired to kill. Whether Elizabeth, by her own way of sex and fake love, manipulated him into doing it, or even if he conspired with her both before and after to hide the fact that one of them murdered them, both of them are guilty of conspiracy in this murder, and both of them deserved prison. The question is, did Jens Soring deserve to be convicted of doing the killings? Was it him or was it her? I'd love to hear from you about what you think. You can reach me, CharlieCrimebuster, at gmail.com. CharlieCrimebuster at gmail.com. Tell me, who do you think did the deed? What say ye? Which one of the two actually did the killing? Let me know how you feel. And next week, your host, old Charlie Crimebuster himself. I'm going to tell you what I think based on my experience and my investigation by research into this case, I'm going to tell you who I think did the deed. Join us, won't you, next week. And until this time next time, this is Charlie Crime Buster reminding you, be safe, be alert, for the life you save. It may be your very own.